A child prodigy faced the court with an undeniable truth, but he was ridiculed by everyone. No one believed him until something unbelievable happened. His own dog proved the truth in a way that left everyone speechless. What this animal did changed everything and turned the tables in court. Watch until the end to see how this story took an unexpected turn. And if you love surprising stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any incredible revelations. From the moment Ethan Miller could form coherent thoughts, it was clear he wasn't like other children in the small town of Oak Ridge, Massachusetts. While his peers were busy stacking colorful blocks and playing with action figures, 8-year-old Ethan was dismantling his father's old radio, meticulously examining each component before reassembling it, often with improvements. His bedroom resembled less a child's sanctuary and more a junior laboratory, with equations scrawled across whiteboards and half-finished inventions cluttering every surface. His parents, Sarah and James Miller, had recognized their son's extraordinary intellect early on. Sarah, a high school science teacher, had done her best to nurture his curiosity, bringing home advanced textbooks and scientific journals that most adults would struggle to comprehend. James, who worked as an electrician, supplied Ethan with broken appliances to take apart and study. Yet even they sometimes found themselves overwhelmed by the depth of their son's understanding. "Mom, I've been thinking about quantum entanglement," Ethan announced one morning over breakfast, spooning cereal into his mouth with one hand while sketching complex equations with the other. "I think there's an inconsistency in Professor Harrington's latest paper." Sarah exchanged a glance with James. Professor Harrington was a renowned physicist at MIT, and his recent publication had garnered significant attention in scientific circles. "That's interesting, honey," she replied, trying to mask her bewilderment. "I've written him a letter explaining my thoughts," Ethan continued, oblivious to his mother's reaction. "Do you think he'll write back?" Sarah ruffled her son's sandy blonde hair. "I'm sure he'll be very impressed, sweetie." But Professor Harrington never replied. Neither did the dozen other academics Ethan had reached out to over the years. In a world where credentials and reputation reigned supreme, the insights of a child, no matter how brilliant, were easy to dismiss. This dismissal became painfully clear during Oak Ridge Elementary's science fair. Ethan had developed a theoretical model for harnessing clean energy that challenged conventional approaches. His detailed presentation boards towered over the baking soda volcanoes and simple circuit displays of his classmates. The local judges, consisting of high school science teachers and a retired engineer, stood before his exhibit with furrowed brows and skeptical expressions. "And you came up with this all by yourself?" Mr. Davidson, the head judge, asked with thinly veiled disbelief. "Yes, sir," Ethan nodded eagerly. "I've been working on it for months." "It's very creative," Mr. Davidson replied, his tone suggesting he viewed it as more science fiction than science. "But I think you might have misunderstood some fundamental principles." "But I haven't," Ethan protested, pointing to his calculations. "If you look at the equations here, you'll see that—" "Thank you, Ethan," Mr. Davidson interrupted. With a forced smile, "We'll continue with our evaluations." Later that day, Ethan watched as the first-place ribbon was awarded to Jessica Palmer's project on plant growth under different colored lights. His own project received an honorable mention, a consolation prize that stung worse than no recognition at all. "They just didn't understand it," Sarah consoled him on the drive home, watching her son's dejected reflection in the rearview mirror. "Sometimes people aren't ready for new ideas." "But it works, Mom," Ethan insisted, clutching his folder of calculations. "I checked everything multiple times. They didn't even try to understand." It wasn't the first time Ethan had faced such dismissal, nor would it be the last. As the years passed, his brilliance only widened the gap between him and the world around him. By age 12, he had read through MIT's undergraduate physics curriculum. By 13, he was writing papers that would have been considered graduate-level work, papers that remained unread, collecting dust in folders on his desk. Ethan's only companion through these frustrations was his golden retriever, Rusty. The dog had been a gift for his 10th birthday, and while Rusty couldn't understand quantum physics or advanced calculus, he offered something equally valuable: unconditional acceptance. On particularly difficult days, when the weight of being misunderstood became too heavy, Ethan would take Rusty for long walks along the outskirts of town, where an old abandoned orchard provided sanctuary from judgmental eyes. It was during one such walk on a crisp autumn afternoon that everything changed. Rusty, normally content to trot alongside, Ethan suddenly darted off the worn path, barking excitedly as he began to dig furiously near the base of an ancient apple tree. "Rusty, come back!" Ethan called, but the dog continued his frantic excavation, dirt flying behind him. Sighing, Ethan made his way over, prepared to coax his pet away from whatever animal scent had captured his attention. But as he approached, a glint of something metallic caught his eye. Rusty had uncovered something buried beneath the soil. "What did you find, boy?" Ethan knelt beside the hole, gently pushing Rusty aside to get a better look. Using his hands, he carefully cleared away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be a flat metallic object about the size of a hardcover book. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Not quite bronze, not quite copper, with a strange luster that seemed to shift in the dappled sunlight filtering through the tree branches. Ethan carefully extracted the object from its earthen bed. It was surprisingly lightweight, despite its metallic appearance, and its surface was covered in intricate symbols that resembled no language or mathematical notation he recognized. Yet there was something undeniably systematic about the patterns, something that suggested they weren't merely decorative, but communicative. A rush of excitement flooded through him. This wasn't some discarded piece of modern garbage or a forgotten tool. This was something else entirely, something important. He could feel it. "Good boy, Rusty," he whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears while staring at the strange artifact. "Very good boy." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a thrill that had nothing to do with equations or theories. He had stumbled upon a real, tangible mystery, one that seemed to call to him specifically. With trembling hands, he carefully placed the metal plate into his backpack. That night, while the rest of the Miller household slept, Ethan sat at his desk under the glow of his lamp, meticulously cleaning the artifact with a soft brush. As layers of accumulated dirt fell away, the symbols became clearer, more defined. They appeared to be arranged in sequences, with recurring elements that suggested a pattern or code. He traced the strange characters with his fingertip, feeling an inexplicable connection to whoever had created them. For hours, he sketched the symbols into his notebook, looking for mathematical relationships, frequency patterns, anything that might help him understand their meaning. Dawn was breaking when Ethan finally set down his pencil, his eyes burning with fatigue but his mind racing with possibilities. One thing was certain. Whatever this metal plate was, it was old, possibly ancient, and it contained information that had been deliberately encoded by an intelligence that understood complex mathematical principles. He had found something extraordinary. Now he just needed to prove it to a world that had always refused to take him seriously. The following week found Ethan standing nervously before the Oak Ridge Historical Society, a group of academics and enthusiasts who met monthly in the dusty back room of the town library. The metal plate, now carefully wrapped in acid-free cloth, rested in a makeshift presentation box on the table before him. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," he began, his voice cracking slightly. At 14, Ethan was still navigating the unpredictable changes of adolescence, and public speaking remained a challenge, especially when addressing a room full of skeptical adults. Dr. Eleanor Thompson, head of the Historical Society and professor of archaeology at nearby Westfield College, peered at him over horn-rimmed glasses. "We're always interested in local discoveries, young man. Though I must admit, when your mother called about an ancient artifact, I was somewhat skeptical." Several chuckles rippled through the small audience. Ethan felt his cheeks flush but pressed on. "I believe what I've found is significant, not just locally, but potentially globally." He carefully unwrapped the metal plate, revealing it to the assembled scholars. This was discovered buried near the old mason orchard, approximately 2 feet below ground level. As he placed the artifact on the display stand, the room grew quiet. Whatever they had expected, perhaps a colonial-era coin or a Native American arrowhead, this strange metallic object with its intricate symbols was clearly something else entirely. "May I?" Dr. Thompson asked, reaching for a pair of white cotton gloves from her bag. Ethan nodded, stepping back as the archaeologist approached. She examined the plate carefully, turning it over in her gloved hands, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine curiosity. "This is unusual," she admitted. "The material doesn't appear to be any standard alloy I'm familiar with." She traced one of the symbols with her fingertip. "And these markings, they form a mathematical pattern," Ethan interjected eagerly. "I've been analyzing them, and they seem to follow a base 12 numerical system, but with elements that suggest advanced concepts in geometry and possibly astronomy." Dr. Thompson looked up sharply. "That's quite a conclusion for someone your age." "I can show you my work," Ethan offered, reaching for his notebook. "I've documented everything." For the next 20 minutes, Ethan walked the society members through his analysis. He explained how certain symbol groupings appeared at mathematically significant intervals, how others seemed to represent astronomical bodies in precise relative positions. He showed them his attempts at decoding what he believed might be a coordinate system unlike any currently in use. As he spoke, the expressions around the room transformed. The initial patronizing smiles gave way to furrowed brows, skeptical frowns, and in a few cases, thinly veiled amusement. "So what you're suggesting," interrupted Mr. Finch, a retired high school history teacher, "is that this object contains mathematical knowledge beyond our current understanding. Created by whom, exactly?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know who created it. That's why I'm here. I was hoping you might help me date the artifact, perhaps analyze the metal composition." "Young man," Dr. Thompson cut in, her tone noticeably cooler, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I think you may be letting your imagination run away with you." "But the patterns," Ethan began. "Could be coincidental," she stated firmly. "Or more likely, this is some modern creation, perhaps an art piece, or even a prop from a science fiction film." "It was buried 2 feet underground," Ethan protested. "Things get buried all the time," Mr. Finch offered with a dismissive wave. "People dump trash, items get lost, soil builds up." Dr. Bennett, a chemistry professor who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Have you considered that this might be someone's elaborate hoax? Perhaps aimed specifically at someone like yourself, a bright young person eager to make a significant discovery." The suggestion hit Ethan like a physical blow. He hadn't considered that possibility, that someone might have created and buried the artifact specifically to be found. But why would anyone go to such trouble, and how would they have encoded such complex mathematical patterns? I don't think it's a hoax," he managed, his confidence wavering. "Tell you what," Dr. Thompson said, her voice taking on the gentle tone adults used when humoring children, "leave the artifact with us. We'll have the metallurgical composition analyzed, and I'll take some photos to share with colleagues who specialize in ancient writing systems." It wasn't what Ethan had hoped for, but it was something. He nodded reluctantly. Excellent. She smiled, patting his shoulder. And Ethan, it's good to have an active imagination at your age, but remember that in science we must follow the evidence, not our desires. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with promises to contact Ethan once. They had conducted their preliminary analyses. As people filed out, Ethan overheard snippets of conversation. Bright kid, but clearly been watching too many alien conspiracy shows. Reminds me of my nephew, convinced he'd invented a perpetual motion machine. Should be encouraged. Of course, but gently guided toward more realistic pursuits. Humiliation burned through him as he packed up his notes. Only Dr. Bennett, the chemistry professor, paused by his table on the way out. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think the composition analysis will be quite interesting. That's not any alloy I've ever seen. It was small comfort as Ethan walked home, his empty presentation box tucked under his arm. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen when he arrived, her hopeful expression fading as she saw his dejected stance. They didn't believe you, she stated simply. Ethan shook his head, dropping into a chair at the kitchen table. Won't they think I'm just a kid with an overactive imagination? Or worse, that I've been tricked by someone playing a prank? Sarah sat beside him, placing her hand over his. I'm sorry, sweetie, but this isn't the end. When they analyze it, they'll find some way to explain it away. Ethan interrupted. They've already decided I can't possibly have found anything important. As if sensing his master's distress, Rusty padded into the kitchen, resting his golden head on Ethan's lap. Absent-mindedly, Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. You believe me, don't you, boy? He murmured. Rusty's tail wagged in response, and something about the dog's unwavering loyalty sparked a sudden realization in Ethan. If Rusty had found one artifact, perhaps there were others. The dog had been intensely focused on that specific spot. What if he was responding to something about the artifact itself? Some scent or property that humans couldn't detect. Mom, Ethan said slowly, a new determination forming. I think I need to go back to the orchard. The next day after school, Ethan returned to the abandoned orchard with Rusty, this time equipped with a small garden spade, a brush, and a metal detector borrowed from Mr. Peterson next door. The autumn afternoon was growing chilly, but Ethan barely noticed as he led Rusty back to the exact spot where they'd made their discovery. Remember this place, boy? He asked, kneeling to ruffle the dog's fur. We need to find more. Can you help me? Rusty sniffed around the area where they'd found the first plate, but seemed less interested than before. Ethan's heart sank as the dog wandered away, distracted by squirrels and other woodland scents. For nearly 2 hours, Ethan methodically swept the metal detector over the ground surrounding the original dig site, with no results. The sun was beginning to set when he finally sat on a fallen log, exhaustion and disappointment weighing heavily on him. Maybe they're right, he muttered to himself. Maybe it is just some random thing. But at that moment, Rusty, who had been exploring the perimeter of the clearing, began barking excitedly about 50 yards away. The dog was pawing frantically at the earth beneath another ancient apple tree. Hope surging through him, Ethan grabbed his tools and raced toward his pet. Ethan's hands trembled as he brushed soil away from what was unmistakably a second metal plate. Under the fading autumn light, he could see it was nearly identical in size and material to the first, but with entirely different symbols etched across its surface. Rusty circled excitedly, tail wagging as if he understood the magnitude of their discovery. Good boy, Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You're absolutely brilliant. With careful hands, he extracted the second plate from the earth. Unlike the first discovery, which had filled him with curiosity and excitement, this one brought a profound sense of vindication. This wasn't coincidence or hoax. There was something deliberate here, something extraordinary. and only Rusty had the instinct to find it. Rather than turning this new artifact over to the Historical Society, Ethan decided to keep it secret. He needed time to study both plates together, to understand their relationship before once again facing the skepticism of the academic world. Unfortunately, he only had photographs and detailed notes of the first plate, but perhaps that would be enough. Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into the analysis with renewed vigor. His bedroom transformed into a research lab, with printouts of his photos taped to the walls and notebooks filled with observations and calculations. Sleep became an afterthought, meals a distraction from his work. Sarah grew concerned, watching her son retreat further into his obsession. "Honey," she ventured one evening, standing in his doorway, "maybe you should take a break. Go to the movies with Charlie, or hang out at the mall for a while." Charlie Dawson had been Ethan's friend since kindergarten, one of the few kids who never seemed bothered by Ethan's intelligence, perhaps because Charlie's interest lay so completely in different areas, like baseball and video games. Their friendship had grown more distant in recent years, as their differences became more pronounced, but they still maintained a casual connection. "Can't," Ethan replied without looking up. "I'm close to something, Mom. Really close." And he was. By overlaying the patterns from both plates, Ethan had discovered that they complemented each other in ways that couldn't be accidental. Certain symbols that appeared on both plates seemed to serve as reference points, allowing the information to be properly aligned. When correctly positioned, the two plates revealed a coherent mathematical system unlike anything in modern use, yet undeniably sophisticated. But it was when he connected this system to astronomical calculations that Ethan made his breakthrough. The symbols weren't just mathematical notation, they were coordinates. Coordinates that, when properly converted, pointed to a specific location right here in Oak Ridge. On a crisp Saturday morning, Ethan stood in the town's old cemetery, GPS coordinates checked and double-checked. According to his calculations, he should be standing directly above something significant, the third piece of the puzzle. Rusty trotted beside him, seemingly unconcerned with the gravity of the moment. "It would be right here, boy," Ethan murmured, looking down at the well-maintained grass between two ancient headstones. "But I can't exactly start digging in the middle of a cemetery." He needed to think. If there was indeed a third artifact buried here, how could he access it without desecrating hallowed ground or getting arrested for vandalism? "Ethan, is that you?" The voice startled him from his thoughts. Turning, he found himself face to face with Dr. Henry Wilson, a man he recognized not from personal acquaintance, but from articles and videos he'd studied online. Once a celebrated theoretical physicist with a promising career at Harvard, Dr. Wilson had fallen from academic grace after publishing controversial papers challenging established scientific paradigms. Now apparently he lived in Oak Ridge. "Dr. Wilson," Ethan managed, momentarily forgetting his mission. The older man smiled, crow's feet crinkling around intelligent eyes. "That's right. And you must be Ethan Miller," Eleanor Thompson mentioned. "You, the young man with the mysterious metal plate." Ethan's guard immediately went up. "Did she send you to talk to me?" Dr. Wilson chuckled, adjusting the bouquet of flowers in his hands. "No, nothing like that. I'm just visiting my wife." He nodded toward a nearby headstone. "But I must admit I was intrigued by Eleanor's description of your find. From what she said, it sounded remarkably similar to something I encountered years ago." Ethan's heart began to race. "You've seen something like it before?" "Perhaps," Dr. Wilson replied carefully, though the academic community was less than receptive to my interpretations. He studied Ethan's face for a moment. "You know, it's rather cold for a casual stroll through a cemetery. Were you visiting someone as well?" Ethan hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this stranger with his discovery. But something in the man's eyes, a familiar weariness, the look of someone who knew what it meant to be dismissed, made the decision for him. Actually, I think something is buried here. He pulled out his notebook. I found a second plate, and when I analyzed them together, they seemed to point to these exact coordinates. Dr. Wilson's expression shifted from polite interest to intense focus. He placed his flowers beside his wife's headstone, then turned back to Ethan. "Show me your calculations." For the next hour, the unlikely pair sat on a cemetery bench, huddled over Ethan's notebook as he explained his methodology. Dr. Wilson asked pointed, insightful questions, tested Ethan's logic, and proposed alternative interpretations, all without a trace of condescension. "This is remarkable work," he finally said, turning to the last page of calculations, "especially from someone without formal training in cryptography or ancient languages." "Then you believe me?" Ethan asked, barely daring to hope. "I believe the evidence you've presented deserves serious investigation," Dr. Wilson replied carefully. "As for what exactly these artifacts are, that remains to be seen, but your approach is scientifically sound." For Ethan, those words were more validating than any academic accolade. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. The challenge now, Dr. Wilson continued, is figuring out how to investigate further without disturbing the cemetery. "I've been thinking about that," Ethan admitted. "The cemetery records might tell us if anything unusual was found when these plots were dug, or if there's a maintenance tunnel or crypt nearby we could access legally." Dr. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good starting point. I happen to know the cemetery caretaker, Joe Simmons. He might be willing to help us." As they rose to leave, Rusty, who had been patiently lying nearby, suddenly lifted his head and growled, a low, warning sound that Ethan had rarely heard from his normally friendly dog. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, scanning the cemetery. About 50 yards away, a man in a dark jacket was watching them through binoculars. When he realized he'd been spotted, he quickly retreated to a black sedan parked on the cemetery's perimeter road. "That's odd," Dr. Wilson muttered, watching the car speed away. "Did you recognize him?" Ethan shook his head, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. "No, but I don't think he was here to pay respects to the departed." "Perhaps not," Dr. Wilson agreed grimly. "Ethan, where exactly is the second plate?" "Now? At home, hidden in my room. Why?" "I think you should move it somewhere safer, and we should probably expedite our research." Seeing Ethan's confused expression, he added, "I've had my research stolen before. If these artifacts are what I suspect they might be, there are people who would go to great lengths to suppress their discovery." "But why?" Ethan asked, struggling to understand. "If these plates contain advanced knowledge, wouldn't that be something to celebrate?" Dr. Wilson's smile was tinged with sadness. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But history is full of examples of revolutionary discoveries being suppressed because they threatened established power structures or contradicted prevailing theories. Not everyone welcomes paradigm shifts." That evening, Ethan and Dr. Wilson sat in the Millers' living room, explaining their theories to a skeptical but supportive Sarah. On the coffee table between them lay both metal plates, their strange symbols catching the lamplight. "So, you believe these artifacts contain knowledge from an advanced ancient civilization?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the doubt from her voice. "The evidence suggests an understanding of mathematics and astronomy that wasn't supposed to exist until much later in human history," Dr. Wilson explained. "It's not unprecedented. The Antikythera mechanism, for instance, demonstrated astronomical knowledge we didn't think existed in ancient Greece. Duh. But this would be far more significant," Ethan added eagerly. "The numerical system alone is revolutionary, and if we're right about the coordinates." A sharp bark from Rusty interrupted their conversation. The dog was at the front window, hackles raised, growling at something outside. James Miller, who had been quietly listening from his armchair, moved to the window and peered through the blinds. There's a car parked across the street. Been there for at least an hour. Dr. Wilson and Ethan exchanged alarmed glances. We need to move quickly, Doctor. Wilson said, his voice tense. Tomorrow morning, meet me at the Historical Society's archives. I'll arrange for us to access the cemetery records. As Dr. Wilson prepared to leave, he placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. Keep the plates separated and hidden tonight. And remember, no matter what happens next, you've already accomplished something extraordinary. You've seen what others refuse to see. That night, Ethan lay awake. Rusty curled protectively at the foot of his bed. Outside, the occasional sweep of headlights across his ceiling reminded him of the unknown watchers. Rather than fear, however, he felt a strange, calm certainty. After years of being dismissed and underestimated, he had found not only evidence of something world-changing, but also an ally who understood its significance. Tomorrow, they would seek the final piece of the puzzle, the key that would silence the doubters once and for all. The Historical Society archives were housed in the basement of Oak Ridge's small museum, a converted Victorian mansion that had once belonged to the town's founding family. The musty room was lined with metal shelving units containing boxes of documents, photographs, and artifacts from the town's modest history. Ethan arrived precisely at 9, as instructed, with Rusty waiting patiently in the car under Sarah's watchful eye. Dr. Wilson was already there, speaking in hushed tones with Martha Hillier, the elderly volunteer who managed the archives. "Ah, here he is now," Dr. Wilson smiled, beckoning Ethan over. "Martha has kindly agreed to help us locate the cemetery records. Though I still don't understand why you're so interested in old burial plots," Martha sniffed, adjusting her glasses. "Especially from that section of the cemetery. Those graves haven't been disturbed in over a century." "It's for a historical research project," Dr. Wilson explained smoothly. "Ethan here is doing remarkable work on Oak Ridge's founding families for a school assignment." Martha seemed unconvinced, but led them to a filing cabinet nonetheless. "The cemetery records are organized by date. The older ones are handwritten, so mind you be careful with them." For the next hour, Ethan and Dr. Wilson carefully combed through yellowed ledgers and faded maps. They discovered that the area corresponding to their coordinates had indeed been excavated once before, not for a grave, but for a planned mausoleum that was never completed. "Look at this," Ethan whispered, pointing to a notation in the margin of an 1897 survey map. "Construction halted due to discovery of unusual subsurface structure requiring further archaeological assessment." "But there's no record of what they found," Dr. Wilson murmured, flipping through subsequent pages. "The project was simply abandoned." "Maybe there's something in the archaeological collection," Ethan suggested. They approached Martha again, who directed them to a catalog of the museum's holdings. Most items were mundane: arrowheads, colonial coins, antique tools, but one entry caught their attention: an identified metal artifact discovered 1897 during Hawthorne Mausoleum excavation. Currently in storage, catalog Junrei 237. Martha frowned when they requested to see it. "That's in deep storage. We don't have it on display. It could take days to locate." "Perhaps I could expedite the process," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Dr. Eleanor Thompson stood there, arms crossed, with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting them. "Henry, I thought I might find you here when you called about cemetery records." Dr. Wilson straightened. "Eleanor, we're conducting some legitimate historical research." "With a 14-year-old boy?" she asked skeptically. "A 14-year-old who made a discovery your entire department failed to properly investigate," Dr. Wilson countered. "We're looking for artifact 8237. Dr. Thompson's expression shifted subtly. "That old thing? It's just a piece of metal junk that was never properly identified. Why waste your time?" If it's just junk, you won't mind us examining it, Ethan spoke up, his voice steadier than he expected. For a long moment, Dr. Thompson studied them both. Then, surprisingly, she shrugged. Fine. I'll have it brought up from storage. But I warn you, you're going to be disappointed. An hour later, they stood around a table in the museum's conservation room. Dr. Thompson placed a small archival box before them and stepped back, a strange tension evident in her posture. When Ethan lifted the lid, his breath caught. Inside, cushioned by acid-free tissue, lay a metal plate identical in size and material to the two he'd already found. This one, however, was covered in even more complex symbols, arranged in concentric circles around a central design. The third piece, he whispered. Dr. Wilson carefully examined it without touching. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. And look at the central motif. It's a representation of a planetary system. Dr. Thompson watched them with narrowed eyes. It's an interesting decorative object, certainly, but hardly the revolutionary artifact you seem to think it is. Eleanor, Dr. Wilson said quietly, you know better than that. The metallurgical analysis you ordered on Ethan's first plate came back, didn't it? What did it show? A flash of something, guilt, frustration crossed her face. The results were inconclusive. Were they? Dr. Wilson pressed. Or did they show an alloy composition that shouldn't exist in any artifact of pre-modern origin? That would simply indicate a modern forgery, she insisted. Except modern metallurgy can't reproduce it either, can it? Dr. Wilson continued, I made some calls to colleagues at MIT. They're quite interested in your inconclusive findings. Dr. Thompson's professional composure finally cracked. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? That some ancient civilization had mathematical and metallurgical knowledge that surpasses our own? It's absurd. It would overturn decades, centuries of established archaeological understanding. That's precisely the point, Dr. Wilson replied calmly. Just as Einstein's theories overturned Newton's, just as quantum mechanics revolutionized our understanding of physics, science advances through revolutions, Eleanor, not by clinging to comfortable certainties. Ethan, who had been quietly studying the third plate, suddenly looked up. I need to see all three plates together. The pattern only makes sense when they're combined. Dr. Thompson's eyes widened. 3 plates? You found another one? Ethan nodded. And if I'm right, together they form a complete system, a key to understanding knowledge that was lost or suppressed. After a tense negotiation, it was agreed that they would examine all 3 plates together in the museum's conservation lab, with Dr. Thompson and 2 colleagues present as witnesses. Ethan's parents were called, and the second plate was retrieved from its hiding place. By mid-afternoon, a small, somber group gathered around a large examination table. The 3 plates were arranged as Ethan directed, forming a triangular pattern with specific symbols aligned. The mathematical progression is clear, Dr. Wilson explained to the assembled academics. Each plate builds upon the information contained in the others, but the true brilliance lies in how they interact. Using a specialized light source, he demonstrated how certain symbols on each plate cast shadows that completed patterns on the others, revealing new information that wasn't visible when examining each plate individually. This isn't just advanced mathematics, Ethan added, pointing to specific symbol groupings. It's a unified theory connecting gravitational forces, atomic structure, and electromagnetic energy, concepts our science didn't fully develop until the 20th century. Dr. Bennett, the chemistry professor who had shown interest in Ethan's original presentation, leaned forward with growing excitement. The atomic model depicted here, it's unlike anything in our current understanding, yet it elegantly resolves several contradictions in quantum theory. Even Dr. Thompson couldn't deny the evidence before her. If this is authentic, she said carefully, it would suggest that advanced scientific knowledge existed far earlier than we believed. Possible. Or offered Dr. Wilson. It suggests that this knowledge came from somewhere else entirely. The implications hung in the air, too momentous to be readily absorbed. But for Ethan, the technical implications were secondary to a more personal victory. He had been right all along. After years of dismissal and disbelief, his intelligence and insights were finally being vindicated. As the academics began debating among themselves, Ethan noticed Rusty growing restless at his feet. The dog kept moving between the examination table and the door, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, kneeling beside his pet. Rusty's behavior triggered a realization. The dog had found the first 2 plates. He seemed uniquely attuned to whatever material or energy they emitted, and now he was trying to tell them something else. "Dr. Wilson," Ethan said urgently, interrupting the heated discussion, "I think there's more to find. Rusty's trying to tell us something." The group fell silent, staring at the golden retriever who was now pawing at the door. "This is absurd, Doctor," Thompson began. "We can't possibly base scientific inquiry on a dog's behavior. That dog's behavior led to discoveries your entire department missed," James Miller interjected, speaking up for his son. "Maybe it's time to stop dismissing things just because they don't fit your expectations." After some debate, it was agreed that they would follow Rusty, though Dr. Thompson insisted on documenting everything with video recordings. For scientific posterity, she claimed, though Ethan suspected it was more to protect herself professionally. With the 3 plates carefully secured in a museum transport case, the unlikely expedition set out. Rusty led them confidently through town, past the cemetery, and toward an area that had once been the site of Oak Ridge's first settlement. Now it was mostly an undeveloped woodland preserve, with a few crumbling stone foundations marking where buildings had once stood. The dog stopped at what appeared to be an old well, covered by a heavy wooden lid, weathered by decades of exposure. It took James and Dr. Wilson together to slide the cover aside, revealing a deep stone shaft disappearing into darkness. "There could be something down there," Dr. Bennett said, peering into the gloom. "These old wells sometimes served as hiding places during colonial times." While the adults discussed how to safely investigate, Rusty began barking at something in the nearby underbrush. Ethan followed him, pushing aside tangled vines to discover a small, half-buried metal box. Unlike the plates, this was clearly of more recent origin, perhaps early 20th century. "Look at this," he called, carefully extracting it from the soil. The box was locked, but the rusted mechanism gave way easily when Dr. Wilson applied gentle pressure. Inside, they found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, but still legible. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, dated 1897, the same year as the abandoned mausoleum excavation. "I have secured the 3rd artifact," Dr. Wilson read aloud from the first page. "Like the others, it defies analysis by conventional means. Professor Hawthorne believes they confirm his controversial theories about pre-Columbian contact with advanced civilizations, but I fear something far more significant is at work." The journal belonged to Jonathan Clark, a field archaeologist who had worked on the mausoleum excavation. His entries documented how he had recognized the significance of the 3rd plate immediately and arranged for it to be catalogued in the museum's collection, where he hoped it would be overlooked and forgotten. "The other 2 plates remain hidden where I discovered them." Dr. Wilson continued reading. "It seems prudent to keep them separated. Together, they present implications too disturbing for contemporary understanding. Perhaps future generations will be better prepared for the truth they contain." The final pages described how Clark had been approached by representatives from a secretive scientific organization who had heard rumors of his find. They had offered substantial funding for his research in exchange for exclusive access to the artifacts, an offer he had refused. Shortly afterward, his reputation had been systematically dismantled through accusations of falsified research and academic misconduct. I now understand that some truths are deemed too dangerous by those who control our institutions, the final entry read. I leave this record in the hope that someday someone with courage and insight will complete what I could not. The parallels to Dr. Wilson's own career were unmistakable. He closed the journal quietly, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. So there was a deliberate effort to suppress this discovery, Sarah Miller said, breaking the stunned silence. And it nearly worked. Dr. Wilson nodded. If not for your son and his remarkable dog, these artifacts might have remained separated and their significance unrecognized for generations more. Dr. Thompson, who had been filming everything, slowly lowered her camera. I owe you an apology, Ethan, she said with evident difficulty. I was so concerned with maintaining established archaeological frameworks that I failed in my primary duty as a scientist, to follow evidence wherever it leads. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood nervously in the grand lecture hall of Westfield College. The audience before him was no longer a small group of skeptical local academics, but a packed room of professors, researchers, students, and journalists from across the country. In the front row sat his parents, alongside Rusty, who had been granted special permission to attend in recognition of his role in the discovery. Dr. Wilson stood at his side as they presented their findings, now backed by comprehensive analysis from laboratories at MIT, Stanford, and the Smithsonian Institution. The 3 plates, displayed in a custom-designed case that preserved their triangular relationship, had been confirmed to contain mathematical and scientific knowledge that defied conventional historical understanding. The metallurgical composition includes trace elements in combinations that cannot be reproduced with current technology, Ethan explained, pointing to the projected analysis results. Carbon dating of organic material found embedded in the second plate suggests it was buried approximately 200 years ago, but the knowledge contained in the symbols represents scientific understanding we've only developed in the past century. As questions poured in from the audience, Ethan handled them with growing confidence. Gone was the frustrated boy who had been dismissed and overlooked. In his place stood a young scientist whose name would soon be known worldwide. Whether these artifacts represent knowledge from a lost advanced civilization or have some other origin remains to be determined, he concluded. But what's undeniable is that they challenge us to reconsider our assumptions about human history and capabilities. The standing ovation that followed was something Ethan had never imagined experiencing. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, he felt Dr. Wilson's hand on his shoulder. How does it feel? The older scientist asked, with a knowing smile. Ethan thought for a moment. Validating, he admitted, but also humbling. There's so much we still don't understand. Later that evening, as the Miller family celebrated at home with Dr. Wilson and a select few others who had supported their journey, Ethan slipped away to the backyard with Rusty. Under the star-filled sky, he sat on the grass with his arm around his faithful companion. "We did it, boy," he whispered. "They finally had to listen." Rusty responded by licking his face enthusiastically, completely unaware of his role in changing the course of scientific history. To him, he had simply found interesting things that made his master happy, and that was reward enough. Inside, Ethan could hear the adults discussing the implications of the discovery, the papers that would need to be written, the further research to be conducted. His future had transformed overnight from that of a misunderstood prodigy to a celebrated young scientist with unprecedented opportunities ahead. Yet, as he gazed up at the stars with Rusty by his side, Ethan knew that the most important lesson wasn't about ancient knowledge or academic recognition. It was about persistence in the face of doubt, about trusting his own judgment even when no one else would, and about the unconditional faith of a golden retriever who had believed in him all along. The mystery of the plates would occupy scientists for decades to come, generating theories and counter-theories about their origins and purpose. But for Ethan Miller, they had already served their most important function. They had shown the world that insight and understanding could come from the most unexpected sources, even from a boy and his dog who refused to accept that some things were impossible to know. Dear listeners, we hope you've been captivated by Ethan and Rusty's journey of discovery and vindication. For more emotionally engaging stories that celebrate the triumph of overlooked brilliance, we've created a special playlist available by clicking the link to your left. If this tale of perseverance against skepticism resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that explore the complexities of human potential and the extraordinary connections we form with our animal companions. Don't miss our upcoming content about other remarkable discoveries that changed the course of history. We're eager to read your thoughts and theories about Ethan's discovery in the comments section below.